So we're really happy today to have Irina Zaykovskaya, who has just joined us from Michigan State University. She is a lecturer in the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch. And today the title of her talk is Russian is Not My Ex. We Are Just Estranged, a language learning journey as a love affair. Thanks for being here, Irina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate. One thing I just cannot not start with, as Kate mentioned, I do come from Michigan State University, and the learner I will be talking about, the focal learner, is also belongs to the same Michigan State family as I do. And I really hope that there is nothing we can do, but I hope that the Michigan State community can start healing after the recent tragedy, after the recent shooting. And this is kind of on my mind. And in a way, this talk is a love story to the university in part as well, because this is where this study happened. So, oh, hold on, yes. This is the title of my talk, and this is fitting actually to be talking about it today, just the day after Valentine's Day. This was not planned when we were scheduling this talk. I didn't think about the dates, but it is a story about love. And even though, as the title says, it is talking about being estranged from Russian, although not having Russian as an ex, it is still a story about love. Before I start the talk, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota, where I currently am, is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. And because I'm a linguist, I think it's a good idea to do language acknowledgements as well. And I would like to acknowledge that the place where I'm at is the place where the Dakota language used to be spoken and is still spoken. However, due to the federal policies of genocide and ethnic cleansing in the 19th and the early 20th century, there are currently more second language learners than first language speakers of Dakota. And this is something that it is important for all of us to remember wherever we are, that language histories are complicated, and whenever we contribute to language history, we need to remember what came before that. So the topic of emotions and language learning is one that Meryl Swain calls the elephant in the room. That's the same Meryl Swain who gave us, together with the Michael Cannell, the idea of communicative competence and the output hypothesis. And this is the idea that she formulated in a plenary talk that then turned into an article published in 2013, that emotions is really the elephant in the room, something that we all know about and understand that this is something that is deeply involved in the process of language learning, language teaching, any kind of interaction we have with a language, and yet we do not talk about it enough from the research standpoint. The existing areas of research, according to some recent overviews, are predominantly focused on foreign language anxiety, specifically related to classroom or perhaps assessment, testing anxiety, and everything related to that. Another area that is quite vibrant right now is the acquisition and mental representation of emotional vocabulary that generally falls within the realm of psycholinguistic research, but that's something that psycholinguistics is much interested in. And the third large area of research on emotions is the role of affect, which includes emotions within the second language classroom. Interestingly, it is within the studies of bilingualism and multilingualism that kind of the different shade of emotions is being studied, not within the realm of second language acquisition, second language pedagogy. Aneta Pavlenko, in her really great book, Emotions and Multilingualism, points out that it is not surprising that this individualistic and cognitive view of the affective domain, the one that looks at mental representation, primarily anxiety, and something that happens in the foreign language classroom, emerged in North American academia, where individuals are viewed as autonomous selves and monolingualism rules as the norm. Language learning anxiety as a key explanatory factor in L2 learning outcomes can thrive only in classrooms populated by more or less monolingual speakers who grew up with a deep conviction that foreign language learning is a challenging process in which one can never really succeed, and more importantly, in which one does not need to succeed in a globalized English-speaking world. And I will still be talking about this context. I will still be talking about the context of a North American classroom where a learner is studying a language that is foreign, that is not spoken widely in the United States. And still, I would like to look at what is going on through this lens, through the lens of seeing emotions as interacting with as affecting the relationship between the learner and the language they are learning. So please meet Alyosha. That is the focal participant I will be talking about today. This is obviously a pseudonym chosen by the participant. This is not reflective of his ethnic identity. This is a Russian name he liked. He has a name quite typical for white Americans. He was born in Michigan in 1995 and comes from a, by self-description, working class, middle class family. With his father working as a delivery driver and his mom not currently working. So he's almost a first generation college student, almost, because his mother actually did go to university for a short while, but had to drop out due to family circumstances. So he had some idea of what college was, but still largely that was a big step for his family that he went to college. He started in a regional university and then transferred to State R1 University after 1 year. And that was when he enrolled in a Russian class in his first year at that R1 University, which happened in 2014. During his studies, he went to Russia for a study abroad program. It was a short one, a 6-week program, but that had quite a lasting impact, as I will show. Graduated after that, obviously, with a double major in history and Russian. Went to law school on a full scholarship, but dropped out for personal reasons. And he's currently working at a middle school and towards a teaching license to teach history, maybe because, you know, I talked to him a little while ago, maybe he's already licensed to teach that, I don't know. But the last we spoke, he was working towards that teaching license. So this project, this longitudinal project, started in 2015 when I first met Alyosha in his second year of Russian studies, and lasts until pretty much today. And at this point, I can definitely call it longitudinal. So one note on the approach I'm taking, this approach is narrative because as Swain in that same plenary talk that I mentioned, talks about how narratives, anecdotes, stories of learners' experiences show this centrality of emotion and its connection to cognition, make that connection evident. And generally, this is where we find the most important information about the relationship between the emotional relationship between learners and the language they're learning. There are generally two types. One can do some sort of narrative inquiry. One is what may be called analysis of narratives, when researchers collect stories and then analyze those stories for emerging themes, you know, what we find in those stories. And the other approach is collecting various types of data and using them to put together a coherent story that has the potential to tell us something. And it's the second approach that I'm taking here, inspired in not a small part by a really great collection of such stories by Benson, Barkhuizen, Bodycott, and Brown. They were looking at a very different population of learners. They were looking at learners of English studying in Australia, but that's the idea of taking different types of information you have and trying to put together a coherent story that may be illustrative of certain thoughts and ideas is something that I'm going to do here. So let's start with Alyosha's language learning history before he started, before he took up Russian. He actually has that language learning history, which may not be entirely typical for American undergraduate students, because many of them have not taken languages before, or maybe just for a few years. But he took Spanish for 7 years. It was compulsory in a Catholic school he attended. And as you can see from the quote here, his relationship with Spanish was quite emotional, although I wouldn't call it a love story. Spanish, I hated. I absolutely hated Spanish because I didn't want to study it, because it's so similar to English and so easy to learn for English speakers. I hated it. I hated learning it. I hated going to class. I hated doing homework. I didn't study. I just hated it. Despite that very kind of prominent hatred, he reported having quite good grades in Spanish and having A in classes. But as you can see, the relative, at least school level success in that learning did not result in any warm feelings towards Spanish. Then in high school, he tried learning Japanese, which was by choice. Japanese I was initially interested in, but I didn't like studying Japanese after the first year. I took it as well because the Japanese alphabet and the Japanese grammar is extremely complex. They use 3 alphabet systems in their writing, and they also, one of those systems is Chinese characters. So it's kind of like learning half of Chinese along with something that's completely not Chinese. And I didn't particularly like it all that well. So there is previous language learning history. There is history of, knowing, understanding that what at least the process of classroom learning involves. And again, relative success, at least in terms of the grades he received in class, but either intense hatred towards the studies or something that started as an interest, but turned out to not be an enjoyable experience as with Japanese. And that's where Russian comes in. It was actually a happy accident, because what Alyosha did when he enrolled in his new university is he looked at languages, at the list of in-demand languages that is put out by the US government. He looked at the list and chose Arabic as the language to study, and that was the original goal. However, where the accident comes in is that the Arabic classes were full. They were simply full and he couldn't enroll starting in the first year. And because as a history major at that time at the university he was at, there was a requirement, a 2-year requirement to study a foreign language, he had to choose a language early on. So he chose the next language on his list, which was Russian. And you can see a tweet that is on September 4th, 2013. My life will now consist of studying Ruski, which means Russian. And that is very early on. We can see that September 4th is something that happens early on in the semester. An accident. Just a person couldn't enroll in Arabic, went to Russian and started taking classes. And from then on, the events start unfolding very, very quickly. Once I started actually taking classes, I fell in love with the language and I decided to major in it after a semester of studies. That after a semester of studies was said in an interview that was conducted later, but I was able to find this tweet on because the participant allowed me access to his social media feeds, and you see that he signed the Russian major on October 15th. Just about a month and a half after starting to learn the language. We saw the initial tweet on October 4th, or on September 4th, and on October 15th, we see that, it's already a decision to add a Russian major to his history major. By the way, the total allegiance to the motherland and her leader, Comrade Putin, is a joke. This is not a political statement. This is I know that because this is kind of a theme of joking through using the vocabulary, typical Soviet time vocabulary, which comes from studying history, and that's something that's the type of humor he likes to employ. This does not reflect a political position in this case. So, and from then on, that's a self-admission that it was falling in love with the language, and since then, again, these studies started happening quickly. And he kept reading that it's a love affair for me, but it's also something that, for the most part, I have done relatively well in. It clicks mentally for me in a way that Japanese did not. And that's an important point, because very often we think about language learning as something that, either influenced by aptitude, whether, a learner has enough aptitude to study foreign languages, or maybe not, or maybe they're struggling. And at least to my knowledge, there isn't much research that is looking at the effect of studying different languages for the same learner. And this topic of falling in love and finding something that clicks mentally resonates with what De Waele points out in his book in 2010, that a learner with a usually low level of motivation for learning foreign languages may suddenly fall in love with a text, a film, a song, or a speaker of the L2, resulting in a shift in attitude and concomitant progress. And we see that in the case of the learner I'm talking about, it's not a text or a film or a song, it's language in general, it's the sound of it, and lots of other things. But that's it. That's something sudden. That's something that happens. That's something that is really beyond the control of the instructor, and probably beyond the specific control of the learner. And this sudden fall in love is changing the course of language learning trajectory for this learner. And in some ways, and we'll see in some ways, that may even be changing the overall life and career trajectory. Specifically going into the details of what's why this love happens. Again, I'm pretty sure that just like with interpersonal relationships, we can never pinpoint why we're falling in love with a particular person, or in this case, with a particular language. However, when Alyosha tries to kind of parse and tear up the reasons why he feels what he feels towards Russian, he talks about two things. What I love is the kind of directness of it. Sometimes I just think certain things come across better in Russian, and also the poetic nature of the language. I think the language lends itself poetically. It's very poetic. I love the way Russian poems sound, even though I cannot even nearly comprehend the beauty that a native speaker could comprehend, and its flow, and its structure, and its true meaning. Again, that's at the level of hearing something that sounds poetic and musical to the learner, and later on he will start writing his own poetry in Russian, trying to, in some way to catch the flow he's talking about. And that is quite a prominent theme of the language sounding poetic, even if at that point that was, I think, his when the time when this interview was conducted was his second year of study, and he indeed wasn't able to read a lot of poetry in Russian at that point, because the level of proficiency wouldn't allow him to go deep into poetry in terms of understanding all the levels of meaning, and even just at the level of language. So in his second year of study, he went on a study abroad program. The study abroad program took place in Russia, and was a trip from, obviously, the United States. They started in St. Petersburg. You can see St. Petersburg here. From there, the group with their professor traveled to Moscow. And, well, obviously, they first spent some time in St. Petersburg as tourists, just going around to museums and on excursions and lots of other entertainment type of activities. Then they went to Moscow and did the same thing. They just learned some history, they walked around, they visited museums. And then after, again, a few days in Moscow, they boarded a train to go to Volgograd, which is a not a small, definitely not a small one, but not one of the largest cities in Russia, which is located, as you can see here, towards south of Moscow, and the overall trip from St. Petersburg to Volgograd would take about 23 hours. Yeah, that would be the length of the trip. And reflecting back on that trip, just snippets from interviews and journal entries, Alyosha says that St. Petersburg is beautiful. You kind of fall in love with St. Petersburg. Moscow is beautiful, but it's just huge. And then Volgograd is miserable. Volgograd is the place where the actual study abroad happened. So where the learners were no longer in a tourist mode. They did not stay at hotels or hostels. They stayed in a host family, and they attended classes at a local college. So that was quite a routine life in that place. So what happens is pretty much without consciously knowing it, without being able to kind of talk about it in the language that a psychologist would, Alyosha describes different stages of culture shock that he encountered and he went through. I went from despair, like pure despair, to depression, and then acceptance. Those are pretty much textbook stages of culture shock. What triggered this the sequence of events was the kind of not a very significant on the surface event. Monday, I hit a low after losing my travel itinerary. I wanted to leave so horribly. All I could think of was returning to the train station and leaving for Amsterdam. I hated it here. So this is something that Alyosha jotted down in a journal. And later in an interview, he said that actually it wasn't a big deal. So that wasn't something that led to any catastrophic consequences. That was and that travel itinerary that was lost could be easily restored through just a couple of emails, and it was, but it's not obviously about the actual item that was lost. It's about the feeling of being alone, very far from home, and in a situation where it is very the situation that is very unusual. And you see, so the journal entry was on May 27th, and before that, so you see it was kind of a lasting impression. You see a Twitter post that was sent to the wall of his American Russian instructor. Teacher, when does the, oh my God, send me back to America ASAP, phase of culture shock end? And that was posted from Volgograd. So we see that language itself, we saw how happy the learner was just learning Russian at the sound of it and everything. But even with that very positive attitude and this very positive approach, you see that the learner was not able to avoid something that meets students in the study abroad context very frequently. I apologize. Something that we typically call culture shock. However, he did recover, and he talks about how we were that far out and nobody spoke English. I mean, even the professors that taught English, they didn't really speak English that well. It would stress you out in ways that you've never felt stressed, and that's weird on your body. He talks about this experience of being in a different place and also in the different linguistic environment as a full body experience. And but then you see a Facebook post from June, so a couple weeks passed. I keep forgetting that whistling inside the house is apparently paramount to summoning Satan himself in Russia, and or trying to raise Hitler from the dead. I'm just summoning Chinggis Khan, lay off me, mom. So the context for this post is that there is this superstition in Russia that you should not be whistling inside a house because that would bring about the kind of poor financial state. So there you will have no money if you whistle in the house. And his host mom was chastising him for whistling at home. But what we see here is the change in the way he's talking. about the experience, because we see that kind of the his sarcastic self and his humor is coming back. So he's not anymore talking in the sense of kind of being quite serious, wanting to leave and talking about feeling despair. He's talking about probably not a great experience of being chastised by a host mother, but that experience is now, while still in place, while still in during that study abroad experience, that is already the experience that he's able to process through his usual coping mechanisms of humor, sarcasm, and overall approach of trying to see something fun in it. And that would be evident from journal entries, from different social media posts, and he will bond with a bunch of stray dogs near the place where he lived, and he would be talking about riding public transport and studying facial expressions of people. And one of the things that, in his own admission, helped the most, something that he kind of credits with his eventual recovery, is just small achievement in being able to communicate in the language itself. Going to a cafe and being able to ask for the Russian menu and not an English one. Just being able to buy something at a grocery store and being understood by the salesperson, and so on and so forth. And by the time he left the country, you see that this is the post at the in June that comes at the end, towards the end of his trip, probably when he's about to board a plane or a train to leave Volgograd. Russia, you have been the experience of a lifetime. The motherland will always be in my heart, right next to Comrade Lenin and the crazy trolley bus driver. That would be a story that he kept telling about the driver that went off route and just had fun instead of working and taking the passengers where they were supposed to be taken. And you see, I mentioned before that with thinking of Russian as a poetic language, he started writing some poetry in Russian. He started doing that while in Volgograd and then continued when back home. This is from October of the same year, already back home, back on campus. Originally, that was written in Russian, but the translation also belongs to Alyosha, and that's a poem about St. Petersburg. Often I hope to be not far from you, simply for no reason more than to listen to Tchaikovsky, to drink maybe coffee, enjoying fall's weather on Nevsky Prospect in old St. Petersburg, as we gaze upon the Winter Palace and forget about life with coffee and music. So again, in the original, this is already the attempt to merge the experience, the actual life experience of studying abroad, of seeing the context for the language he likes so much, and that quality of the language that he sees as poetic. So he's starting to write poetry about the place and in the language he's studying. He continues his language learning journey. He graduates from university a year and a half after going on a study abroad program, and initially enrolls in a summer immersion program in Middlebury. Probably a lot of the people in the United States know that this is a place where this is an established place where immersion programs in multiple languages are offered, and many students, either current students or students who just graduate, go there to kind of take their learning to the next step, and very often they succeed because Middlebury, it is an immersion program, while in the United States they have a language pledge and lots of both instruction time and extracurricular activities. So he enrolls in this program thinking about, kind of taking his language skills to the next level, but he ends up dropping out of the program just very shortly into it, for reasons entirely unrelated to instruction. Those are personal reasons. I did not end up finishing the program. I was in a relationship at the time that wasn't so good. And so really pressure from my ex, kind of the whole not being able to converse in English thing caused a lot of mental stress. But I regret doing that because it was, even to this day, something that I really regret. And he specified that regret applies to dropping out of the program. And again, this is something that, is not directly related to either the Russian language or the instruction, but that is something where life interferes with the studies. Quite shortly after that, he gets into law school with a full scholarship, which is a big achievement, but he drops out from that program as well, and also for personal reasons, which comes from kind of the same place where dropping out of Middlebury comes off. And that was a combination of things. I didn't think it was for me, but it was also a really toxic relationship on me. So mentally, I kind of burned out. I had a near breakdown. I moved home, trying to think of the timeline, probably February, March 2018, lived at home, and for over a year, I worked kind of crap jobs, just trying to figure out where I am. So we see that at this point, while he graduated with a double major in history and Russian and intended to make Russian at least partially his career, because the law school where he got in, he went there with the idea of focusing on human rights in Eastern Europe, for which using the Russian language would be a big part. And that doesn't work out, which again, something that does happen to people in life, to all of us. We plan something and then the plans do not come true. After which he moves to a different state and starts a teaching career. Starts as a teaching assistant, and as I said, then decides to likes the experience and decides that actually being a teacher may be a good idea and starts working towards a teaching license in history. So the important question here is what stays when we have a learning experience, because very often in research, we focus on learners who are currently in programs, who are currently studying language, or what is very often the term of successful language learners, people who learned a language and are using it in a career. So, for example, they became interpreters, or they're working in business where they are actively using their language skills. And people like Alyosha do not often become at the forefront of our inquiry into the relationship between the learners and the language, or if they do, that study stops at the kind of pinnacle of their language learning journey, right? Because if I stop the research, if I stop speaking to Alyosha at the point when he was graduating, that would look like a start of a very promising career in Russian language specifically. And there are things that stay. He talks a lot about how, and I'll go back to that, about what things remain and what things are still relevant from the Russian language journey, even though currently, again, working towards a teaching license in history, Russian is not something that he practices daily. And just one example. So these are two quotes from very different times. One on the left comes from an interview after his study abroad experience in 2015, and he would talk about some students who come to Russia call the Russian face. You'd catch yourself smiling, and then people would be staring at you like, why the hell are you smiling on a bus at 9 a.m. in the morning? And you learned after a couple of times of riding public transport in Volgograd that there is definitely no reason to smile. So, and throughout that interview, fresh after his study abroad program, he would return to that several times and talk about how it was funny that, people would be staring down him and his classmates for smiling on public transport. And they quickly learned that perhaps it would be more appropriate to not smile on public transport, especially at 9 a.m. When traveling to university. And 5 years later, in an interview, when I asked what do you remember from that experience, this is something that still stayed with him. I still, just to this day, remember the very stoic expression on everyone's faces, just because they were out in public. And you don't want to be rude, just laugh or smile in someone's face. So that impression of smiling as being something that people don't do in public, and something that you can offend people with when, smiling at them when it is inappropriate, again, in a public situation. That is something that remained. That is something that he could see years later as an important takeaway. Some big takeaway over time. So I was looking through the data and looking through the most recent interview I had with Alyosha. I was thinking what I could think about, what I could see as the biggest takeaway that could be, that I could say, well, this looks like something that is quite big. And there were two things. So one was related more to the experience of space and general understanding of oneself and the world. And this is the quote I did not choose to put in the slide, but just to briefly mention it. He talked about the vastness, especially traveling from Moscow to Volgograd on a train and just looking at steps on both sides of the train and thinking about how, compared to this apparent vastness, the whole United States felt to him as Rhode Island. But another big takeaway is more related to the language itself. And this is the one I chose to kind of showcase here. I think it makes you understand that there are ways of getting to the same thing, but completely different approaches. I guess just that you can communicate a message in very, very different ways, that even if you try to analyze them on the same wavelength, they're still going to be very different. But you can still communicate that message and it will still get across. Studying over there, I think this is going to be cliche, but being exposed to a different culture. Excuse me. Also, you still see, humans are humans. So I learned that, I think for me, it was that, everyone is still human and there is humanity everywhere. But the way we interact with our culture can be very different, and how we express love or sentiment, or how we just interact in public. So this is something that I found important, because it's a little more than just this cliche idea. And I mean, Alyosha admits himself that this sounds cliche, that humans are humans and there are people everywhere, but he goes a step beyond than that. He talks about how, while it is indeed the basic idea that humans are humans, there is this kind of deeper understanding that there are different ways of being human, and there are different ways of communicating your humanity. And when obviously he talks about expressing love or sentiment, that is a way of expressing one's humanity, and those ways can be different. And he could talk about some, specific sentence structures and elements of the language that could, in that way, show how it is at the same time the same but different in a way you phrase it. So, of course, when I was interviewing him years after, and remembering how prominent the topic of falling in love and love affair, and just generally talking about how much love he had for the language, because in the initial interviews, I once calculated, and the most frequent words, apart from obviously, prepositions and articles and other function words, were the words love and fascinated and enamored, everything related to that topic of love. So I asked him again, you were saying that you fell in love with Russian and everything. So how would you describe the status of that love affair now? And that's what he said. I would say it's still there, because I thought it was going to be my career, especially in Middlebury. That's the one thing. I don't regret it, because I wouldn't have met my girlfriend now. I wouldn't have gotten into teaching had that not happened. But when I went there, it was on the cusp of being very conversationally fluent, being able to really hold my own. And so when that fell apart and I left, I think my interest didn't go away, but I also felt guilt and remorse to be as far as I was. And also frustration at myself, because I was so close after all those years of studying. that's a very raw and honest account of what happened. And here we see very different types of emotions. And this is still talking about relationship with the language as something very real, as if it's interaction with another human being, right? So, and we see other emotions mentioned, but at this point, this is not just love. There is guilt and remorse and frustration because of the situation, because this relationship didn't work out in the conventional sense, because even though he planned, at that point he did plan to make a career out of that, that didn't happen. And he did not stay in this relationship if we keep the relationship metaphor going. However, he does not consider Russian to be his ex, because that's a direct question I asked. If we keep this metaphor, would you say that Russian is now your ex? I wouldn't say that. I would say maybe a little estranged, but something that we could both mutually come back together on, if that makes sense. It's funny because I know the language ability is still there, because I will talk in my sleep, and most of the time it's in Russian. So he talked about how his friends and his girlfriend would say that he would talk in his sleep, and he would talk in his sleep in Russian, and he was entertaining a thought of recording it, during the night and listening to that. I don't know if he ever did that, at least I didn't share that, but that is something that is staying with him and kind of still influencing the life as it goes on, without the presence of Russian in it on the surface. And I would like to kind of wrap it up and to talk about the relationship, about the impact of that relationship, and why in general stories like this matter for us, and what we can take away from them. I would like to quote Clay Crumsh. This is a quote that I use in every teaching philosophy I write, because that resonates with me, but also I think that illustrates this story quite well. We're fooling ourselves if we believe that students learn only what they are taught. While teachers are busy teaching them to communicate accurately, fluently, and appropriately, students are inventing for themselves other ways of being in their bodies and their imaginations. Success in language learning is an artifact of schooling, of the need by institutions to demarcate those who know from those who don't. But the language learning experience itself is neither successful nor unsuccessful. It can be lived more or less meaningfully and can be more or less transformative, no matter of what level of proficiency has been attained. And I would say that the story I've told today illustrates that perfectly, in a way that this love affair with Russian seems to have been a profoundly transformative experience for the life of this person, even though we cannot say that Alyosha achieved conventional language learning success that we would define as, necessarily hitting a very high level of proficiency. He talks about being on the cusp of that, but never kind of coming over that cusp and making a career out of that. So we see that the experience is still profound. And very often when we are doing, it's generally a tradition of, when we're doing research, we should think about, language learning research, we should think about what pedagogical implications it might have. And on the surface, it may look like a story of a single learner, what kind of pedagogical implications may it have, right? It's not something that has direct implications. However, I think it is, and that's why I have the question mark here as well. However, I think there is a big takeaway here, at least there was for me as an instructor, as a language teacher. So the first thing is, it is important to understand that learners develop relationships with the language they're learning, not just a relationship with the instructor, not just a relationship with the peers, but with the language itself. And that relationship may be a love affair, or it may be the relationship that, Alyosha had with Spanish at some point in his life, which was characterized by some intense negative feeling, but that is nonetheless the relationship that is intimate between the learner and the language. And it is important to accept that relationship as something that is beyond our control as instructors. There are a lot of things we can control, and I think that's why the tradition of studying, for example, foreign language anxiety in emotions research is so prominent, because when we're studying foreign language anxiety, this is something that we have the potential of controlling, right? We can think about strategies to lower, for example, test anxiety. How can we create a classroom in which learners feel less anxious and therefore more willing to communicate? How we create the assessment materials that would allow our learners to not be stressed out while they're taking exams and so on. But also, it is important to understand that part of the relationship, and especially when we're talking about something that is characterized by love, but by some positive feelings, is not under our control. That is something that happens independently of us. And those relationships definitely need to be respected. Again, the story I told today is a story of love. Some of such stories may be stories of something that is not love, but some other relationship. But they do happen, and they will keep happening. And I think there is a lot more both to this story and generally to the stories of language learners and their relationship with the language, emotional relationships with languages, that is to be told. And yes, that's I think it's a good Valentine's Day takeaway that we need to respect their relationships, however, or whichever form they take, whether this is a very happy marriage that lasts for 50 years until the death parts the participants, or this is a love affair that lasts for a while and then kind of the participants in the relationship become estranged. And in all of those events, the relationship itself has the power to transform not just the life, but both. It has the potential to transform both the actual life and the emotional life of learners, of language learners. Thank you, and I would be happy to answer questions. I think I'm going to start with the chat because there is a question that was sent to me directly. So that's I think I will just repost them because I think that was in error. I don't see any any personal part of the question here. So I'm going to just post it in chat so that people see the questions here.
Yeah, while Irina is doing that, we invite you to add more questions to the chat, or if you would like to ask a question orally, please raise your hand and we can call on you. I think we're changing the settings so that you will be allowed to unmute yourself if you prefer to ask a question orally. So Irina, do you want to go ahead and take the questions from the chat? Would you like me to read them aloud?
Oh, yeah, please. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, do you think that learning another language can be very stressful, and how? Sorry, I'm just pausing to read through the whole thing to see if they're connected. I think that's just the first question, so maybe we can talk about that one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because learning a language is something new that a person does. And everything new that we do can be a stressful event, and it can be stressful for both external reasons and internal, right? Because languages are learned, sometimes languages are learned in a context where a person doesn't have a choice to do or not to do that. And when you're doing something you're forced to do, there is kind of this obvious potential for being stressed. But also, even if we're talking about a consensual relationship, when a person is learning a language willingly, it can still be difficult. It can still be something that leads to frustration over difficulty, frustration over something that initially doesn't come easily, and so on. So there is a lot of different ways in which language learning can be stressful. Just the fact that it may be very enriching and transformative doesn't mean that stress is not involved.
Yeah, I see Matthias has his hand up, but let me just go ahead and ask the second part of this question. And I think it kind of relates to some of the issues of identity that you were talking about in relation to pedagogical implications and sort of the overall findings of your study. And this is about sort of understanding the culture, when you study the language and the culture of, your second language or the language that you're learning, does this lead you to think differently? I mean, you talked a lot about feeling differently in relation to emotions, but did you get any sense that your participant was sort of changing the way he was thinking about the language and his relationship with it?
Definitely. He talked about changes in thinking about a lot of things, not just the language, but generally kind of perception of self, perception of the world. So I cannot, and I think generally when we are, because learning a language is learning a new way of saying something, right? We are learning a new method of doing something. And whenever we are learning a new method of doing something, that changes the way we think. And I don't think we can easily measure the level, the amount of that change, whether this is a profound change as we can, as in some sci-fi movies or books, we see, somebody learns a language and suddenly gets the new life philosophy. We think of Arrival or some other sci-fi movies. It doesn't necessarily have to be that level of, having a profound revelation through learning a language, but it can be something subtle that may not necessarily be measurable, but definitely when we learn something new, it does change the way we think. So yes, learning a language definitely would change something. How and whether we can measure it, that's a different story. I don't know how to.
Thanks. Matthias, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I also have a question relating the quotation you had up and what we've just said, that learning a language changes your way of being in the world, your way of thinking and feeling. And I wonder if you think about pedagogical explanation, if there aren't certain pedagogies that somehow facilitate this kind of transition into a different way of being in the world more than others. And I can think of, for example, task-based pedagogies. Is this something that you think is better suited to accommodate this complex kind of point of departure? I would think yes, but I wonder what you think about this.
I think it's a trick question, Matthias. It's a difficult question because because to me, and I really do not want this to be kind of the defeat type of takeaway, but for me, the big takeaway is really that there are some elements of the relationship between the learner and the language that are outside of our control. And love is something that is that element, right? I do not think that there is anything that an instructor can do to make that situation happen, to make the situation in which a learner comes in and falls in love with the language, because that has to be something that speaks to the learner personally. There is a lot we can do. We definitely can do a lot, and that would be the overall study of effect in the language classroom, right? That's where that line of study comes in. We can do a lot to make a learner comfortable in the classroom, and therefore make it more likely and possible that they find something, that text, that film, that song, something that catches them and makes them fall in love. But I don't think there is any method of teaching that can make somebody fall in love with the language. It's just like we cannot willingly fall in love with a person. That's just something that happens, but we can develop a productive relationship with pretty much anyone if we want to. But I definitely agree with you that task-based pedagogy would be one of the methods that open up that road, that open more possibilities, because the methods like this, as task-based and some other approaches, open up more, open the learners to more authentic input, and through that, and to ability to use the language in practice, and through that it opens the possibility of developing those relationships, but not but there isn't a method that will make you fall in love with the language.
So there's another question in the chat about the role of the instructor. So I'm going to go ahead and read the question rather than paraphrase it. So it's, if students develop relationships with the language they are learning, where does that put their instructor? Isn't the instructor a part of that relationship by default? And I think that's somewhat related to what Matthias was asking too, about the approaches that we use in the classroom to sort of bring out these questions of identity and emotion in relation to language learning.
The instructor is definitely part of, the instructor is necessarily in a relationship with the learner, but I think it's a three-way relationship, right? So I don't think that the instructor is always the mediator between the learner and the language. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's kind of more a three-way relationship, because yes, it is a big part of that. And there is a lot of studies looking specifically at the role of instructor in language learning. And we definitely know that, instructors have the potential to just make learners not want to continue just because they don't feel comfortable in the classroom. So we have a huge responsibility to create an environment in which the learner is safe, especially at that early vulnerable stage of their relationship with the language, where they feel safe to continue their exploration. But again, I think it's an important line to draw between our between where we can play a role and where we can't. So we definitely can create the atmosphere. It's in a way, I mean, I am not a psychologist, so this is just a metaphor that comes to mind. But in a way, this is like being a therapist that may help someone work on their relationships with other people and with their families and generally with the world around them. But this is not a job of the therapist, and it is not possible for a therapist to just make those relationships happen or make those relationships change, right? So we can open up those opportunities, and we should, right? This is where the instructor comes in. And also it's not that the instructor doesn't play a role. Instructor plays a role in, offering as much as possible and showing what the language has to offer. But there is the intimate part of the relationship that stays between the learner and the language itself.
So I think we have time for one more question, and Alfred has had their hand up for quite a while. So Alfred, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, fine. Very interesting. And I would like to know, they say that a child can learn another language perfectly with the natural speaker fluency, but the adult cannot. Can you tell me if that's true? And if it is true, if an adult tries to learn another language, if in a sense it rejuvenates his brain back to childhood, kinda.
So that's an interesting. So does learning a language rejuvenate the adult brain? That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of those kind of types of relationship, that's where I would very much recommend you the book by Aneta Pavlenka, Emotions and Multilingualism, because this is
just
where,
a minute. Let me get that down.
Yes, sure. I'll just open the slide where I had it at the beginning so that you can look at the title. But that's, yes. Oh, yeah. Kate just typed it in chat as well. This is something that we do not have enough research on, in a sense. So we do not know. We do not have enough information to talk about, whether, for example, even the mechanisms involved in language learning, to what extent the mechanisms are the same between a child and an adult. We know that they're not exactly the same, but we know that there may be similar processes, but there is a big conversation whether, it's just that adults are never in a situation when they are receiving constant input for many months without any pressure to, produce language as it happens with a baby, and to what extent the fact that adults do not have that environment plays a part in potentially different outcomes. But I think that definitely learning a language is something that becomes an emotional experience, regardless of the age that a person is learning a language. We are in a relationship to both the languages we speak natively and languages we learn throughout life. And to me, if I'm answering not as a language researcher, but just as a person, absolutely learning languages is rejuvenating. If not cognitively, then emotionally for sure. But that's a personal response, not something that I can back up by research. I choose to believe that it does rejuvenate us.
Thank you, Irina. I think that's a nice way to end our session today. We've reached the top of the hour, and so we want to thank all of you for coming, and we want to thank Irina for such an interesting talk and for all of your thoughtful questions, and we hope to see you at a Carla event in the future. Thank you. Have a great day.
Yeah.